I made so many mistakes on this dress. I mean, so many mistakes. At one point, I stopped what I was doing to voice my frustrations to my inanimate camera. And this collar is... like, can we just... It was a difficult make for me, and I'm going to chuck it up to my 3 little ones, who I love dearly, but clearly I am tired. I used a new pattern, and I mean no biggie. I don't bat an eye with new patterns, especially dresses. I've literally made hundreds of dresses at this point. I modeled this Valentine's Day dress after a photo I saw on Pinterest. I love the cap sleeves and the beaded collar design. And there was my first mistake. I cut out the correct bodice piece for the front on the fold, but I didn't notice that this pattern came with a non-cap sleeve version. And lucky me, I cut out the non-cap sleeve version for the bodice back pieces. I didn't realize this until I went to sew my shoulder seams together and they weren't the same length, and I checked the pattern pieces and yuppers, I messed it up. So since I wanted those cap sleeves, I pushed the pieces to meet at the outside of the shoulder seam to give me the greatest chance at having that cap sleeve look, and then I sewed them together, trimmed up that little bit of extra fabric from the inside to create a smooth neckline, and ironed that seam open. With that crisis averted, I switched gears to assembling the skirt. All the skirt pieces are cut out on the fold. I had 1 skirt front as well as 2 skirt back pieces. And I also created a little pocket pattern. The pattern comes with a pocket like on the outside of the skirt, but I didn't really like that design for the look that I was going for with this dress. So I just freehanded this pocket. It's so easy to do. I've done hundreds and hundreds now. If you also want to install a hidden pocket, you need to cut out 4 of these. So I put the pockets right side together with the skirt front and sewed the 2 together. I ironed that pocket away from the skirt, and I repeat the same thing for the back sections of the skirt too. And next I put the back side seam right sides together with the front side seam of the skirt. It is easy to sew the pocket a little off or with a gap, so to avoid this, I like to pin the top of the pocket and then put a pin at the bottom of the pocket and a third pin at the bottom curve of that pocket. And I sew the side seams together, starting at the top of the pocket, sewing a little bit down and going across the top of the pocket, around the curve of that pocket, and then continuing to sew down the side seam of the skirt. I gave that an ironing, making sure to iron the pocket towards the skirt front. There is a lesson learned the hard way many years ago about that. You definitely want your pocket to face towards the skirt front. So switching gears now to that beaded collar. Now I am not an expert in beading. I've done some in the past and it's gone fairly well. I also have no problem trying new things, so I didn't think twice about how to approach this collar. I just went for it. It's kind of a flaw of mine. I drafted up a little design that I like and I traced the shape onto this red sateen and went to work. Okay, first mistake, I didn't cut the sateen with enough overhang to fit properly on my embroidery hoop. Not ideal, but it is fine. I will just be extra careful and work the collar in 2 steps. It's fine. It will be fine. I grabbed some red thread and went to working on the beading. I tied on in the seam allowance of the collar and then oohed and awed over this little collection of beads. They are so much fun. I'm referencing this Pinterest photo, seeing what beads I have to choose from and letting my beadwork take shape from there. This is quite fun at this point, just relaxing, kind of seeing your creation come to life before your eyes. Beading is something I can see myself diving head over heels into once the kiddos are in school. So many things once the kiddos are in school, right? Anywho, once I get the beading done, then I made my next mistake. I assumed the backing of the collar would be too much to attach via a sewing machine. Like the feet would be too big, it would just get in the way. So I just figured I needed to do it by hand. So I carefully thread traced the outline of the collar, and after cutting out the beading piece, I pinned it to the red sateen and used that to cut out its lining. I put the 2 right sides together and again carefully sewed the 2 together by hand. It feels so silly now watching myself stitch these 2 places together by hand, but such is life, live and learn, right? So I do leave an opening on the inside of the collar and trim up around the curves and corner pieces. I turned the collar right sides out, and that proved much more difficult than I was thinking too. There are so many mistakes in this make, y'all. Now before I put together the second side of the collar, I looked at my sewing machine feet. I figured it couldn't hurt because it just went so wonderfully with the first round of the collar. I didn't have any narrow feet for my industrial machine, but luckily I just bought a new domestic machine, and there is this interesting little foot with the tiniest little sidewall. So I used that to sew around the second collar, and it went much better. Lesson learned. Turning the collar right sides out still gave me issues, and after a good ironing, things weren't quite as I was hoping for. Oh, and I forgot to mention this. Some of the thread got stretched out. I guess it got stretched out in the turning process. I'm not really sure. I haven't run across this in my previous beadwork. So let's just put the collar aside for now and finish up the construction of the dress. I'm making the dress so it's fully lined, which means I cut out duplicate pieces out of this white Imperial Bodice. It is some of my absolute favorite fabric, especially to use as a lining. It is just lovely. Just like with the dress, I'm sewing the shoulder seams of the lining and then the side seams of the skirt, but with no pockets for the lining. I gave all of that an ironing and then joined the bodice to its lining with right sides together, matching up the shoulder seams. I start at the back of the neckline, sew all the way around the neckline, and then stop at the other center back. I'm not sewing down those vertical sections yet, since I want my dress to have those little sash straps, bow thing. Next, I understitch the neckline, flipping the entire seam towards the lining and stitching very close to the original seam. Finally, I sew each arm's eye. Then I clip those curves, and there are so many curves to clip here. You do not want to get lazy clipping. This is what's going to allow your fabric to relax and lay nicely in place. And then I grab that sash. So to avoid having a seam at the top of the sash, I cut the sash out on the fold, just moving it down about 1/2 inch to account for the seam allowance that I'm not going to need since it's cut on the fold. I put the sash right side together and sew from one point, turn the corner, and down the length of the sash. I leave that back end open so I can turn the sash right sides out, making sure to clip the curves around the point of the sash. And I like to use a little pointer tool to push the point out, and then I gave the whole thing an ironing. I gather the end of the sash using 2 rows of gather stitches and then sandwich the sash at those little back spots of the bodice. And then I sew all of that together, turning the corner at the bottom of the bodice and sewing across that little section like so. I hope that makes sense. I clipped the corners and turned the bodice right sides out and gave everything a really good ironing. This makes everything on the bodice lay nicely into place. Alright, you ready for another mistake? Here goes. So I love this method of doing the side seams of the bodice and then attaching the skirt, since it allows for a continuous skirt, which we aren't doing in this video, but I've done in many of my other videos. So I just went right ahead, my hunky-dory little self, sewing the bodice seams together, forgetting all about the sash in the back. And I had this clean side seam. And it brought a little smile to my face, and then I tried to tie the sash, and something was very wrong because, duh, there is no hole for one part of the sash to go through. So I marked where the hole should be on both the lining and the bodice, and out came the seam ripper. I re-sewed the side seam and then brought the bodice and lining pieces back together so I could top stitch the 2 holes together. Just a little bit of a cleaner look here, and another crisis averted. So now I simply sew the back seam of those skirt pieces together, each individually, and then I did a very narrow hem on each circle skirt. Generally speaking, I like to keep dress skirt pieces separate from the lining skirt, although there are cases where I will make an exception. This narrow hem on the skirt may look like a hot mess, but just give it an ironing and it falls right into place just like magic, right? Ironing solves so many issues. And here is a neat trick. Since we are lining our skirt, I just put the 2 pieces together, right sides together, and sewed as if I was doing a placket. It's not really a placket, but just bear with me. I put a clip mark at the bottom of that V to allow it to turn nicely to the right sides, and then I turned the skirt's right sides out. And from there, I understitched that little mock placket, and finally, the really exciting part, I'm attaching the skirt to the bodice. I start with the right side of the dress, matching the backs together, the side seams and all that goodness, and then sewing that part of the waist seam together. And then I rinse and repeat for the lining. So, that final puzzle piece, the collar. Oh, this collar. I had intended to sew this into the dress's neckline, but after all the issues with the beadwork, I figured a removable collar would be better, and it would make it easier to clean the garment as well. But first, I had to clean up all that stretched out thread that led to sagging beadwork. So much for having my threads hidden. Once all of that was cleaned up, I basted the collar to the dress, and voila, a fun Valentine's Day feeling dress for my oldest daughter. I've been sewing for easily 15 years now, and I have never been much for following directions, which sometimes leads you into mistakes, but I find I learn a lot more that way, and the lessons really stick with me. I've got 2 Valentine's Day videos, this darling fully smocked dress for my littlest one, and this adorable romper for my son. Go check them out, and happy Valentine's Day, everyone!